So funny story, when they said, hey, you've been accepted, can you fill out this form? They had a section called what's your talk title, even though I had already submitted it when I submitted my talk. And so I haphazardly wrote quantitative research because I wasn't thinking about it, and then I submitted it. And so my actual talk title is Quantitative Data is Your Secret Weapon, but it's still quantitative research, so I apologize for my confusion. So we're here today to talk about data. And I know that the most important question on everyone's mind is, do you pronounce it data or do you pronounce it data? It's okay, we're going to talk about the other stuff too, but really, think about this. But you're a designer of some kind or you're a researcher of some kind, and you spend all your day making decisions, deciding, should we go in this direction or in that direction? Should we figure out this type of feature? Should we improve that type of feature? Should we make this change or should we keep this the same? How do you make those decisions? Well, you have experience in training, so everything that brought you to this point. You have existing knowledge of the market that your company works in or whatever products you've worked on. You have existing knowledge of the product if you've been working on it or researching it at all. And you also have existing knowledge of the customer. And that's all data that's interesting to you, but that's all sort of intrinsic data. And then you have data. I love Star Trek, you will notice a theme. So what is data anyway? Data is sourced information that enables you to make better decisions. And that's why it's different than your experience in training, and that's why it's different than your intrinsic knowledge of the customer, of the market, of the product. Because data is something that you actively go out and find, because it's sourced. You're looking for it somewhere. And better decisions that it helps you to make, you can actually make more informed decisions. Sorry, I feel like the mic keeps cutting out. Is that true or is it in my head? Okay, I'll keep going. You can make measurable, intentional decisions that are more aligned to the goals of your product, your customers, and your company. So that means that data actually is something that we have a lot of in abundance on the qualitative side, if you're a qualitative researcher, because most user research is qualitative. But today we're going to talk about quantitative data, because a lot of user researchers I know, and especially when we talk about user research, what people mean is usability testing, customer interviews, those types of things. Those are very good, keep doing those. But also do quantitative data. So what does quantitative data tell us? Well, it can tell us the impact of the design changes that we're making, of the recommendations that we're telling designers to make. It can tell us how to solve different problems or what problems should be solved. It can help us see what patterns there are and what direction we should take a product next. So data allows us to get a lot of information in a quantitative way and help us make smarter decisions. And that's why quantitative data is just as important as qualitative data. The important thing to remember about data, though, it's just numbers. Everybody thinks, oh, well, what's the data on that? What's the numbers? As if those were objective. They're not. I'm sorry for everybody who thought numbers were objective. But if they were, then I could say, hey, friend, tell me what a 6 means. Anybody, is it good or is it bad? Wait, do you need context? Damn. But that's my point. 6 doesn't mean anything until we give it context. And that context allows us to ascribe meaning to it, which means that the data that you use quantitatively is just as biased as any qualitative data you have. I know everybody's heart just broke because they thought, data, I'll have the numbers and then everything will be right in the world. No, because a 27 for one company on the same metric might be awesome, and in another company it sucks. If I'm a startup and I have 27 new customers, hell yes. If I'm Google and I only got 27 new customers this month, shit. Is it okay to swear? I'm sorry, I forgot to check. Sorry in advance and also in the past. But basically, data is just a constraint. And this is important to remember because when we talk about data, one of the objections I hear a lot from UX folks is, well, data is going to make me less creative. But do you know what else is a constraint? Having to design for mobile. having to design for accessibility. Constraints force us to be more creative, and I would argue that using data and using that to power how you make decisions will make you more creative. Because when you have a giant blank page, you can do anything, which means that your options are limitless. But when you have limited options, you have to get creative to solve those problems. So today we're going to talk about 3 things. We're going to talk about how to identify the data that you need, how to collect it, and how to analyze it at a high level. This is not that deep. So first thing you have to do is identify the data that you need. Context matters, right? We talked about this. So putting your project into context matters because whatever project you're working on doesn't sit in isolation. It's not a black hole. There's a bunch of crap that's influencing it. There's a bunch of crap that it's being influenced by, right? You have your business goals, user needs and goals, current user behavior. So it's important to understand what's the context of this project happening in, and therefore what data do I need to be collecting and need to understand. And now we all know that when we talk about business, they're all really concerned about one thing, money. But your business has other goals that are not make more money, even though that's probably the primary one that everybody is thinking about. And this is a sort of framework that Christina Halverson came up with, that most businesses should be able to tell you these things. You should be able to know, what's the vision here for our company? What's our mission? What are our high-level goals? How are we going to achieve them? How are we going to measure them in the short term? What tactics are we going to try? And what are we going to target? And the place where data comes in is the goals at the very high level, and then also in your targets. And targets are based around tactics, so they tend to be smaller. Be very wary of companies who say, our goal is to post 100 times on LinkedIn this month. That's not a goal, that's a tactic. When you're talking about goals, they need to be higher level, and they need to be able to have different tactics assigned to them, so that way you can see what works and what doesn't. So posting 100 times on LinkedIn is a tactic. The goal might be get 100 new people to sign up for our newsletter. And so if LinkedIn doesn't work, my strategy is not bad, my goal is not bad, I can change my tactic. And that's when the measuring comes in. So some common business goals that you'll want to understand or be thinking about are things like reducing customer service rep calls, increasing signups, decreasing churn. You can read all of these. The one thing I will say is I know Net Promoter Score is not a great metric. Unfortunately, a lot of companies still use it, and so unless you are someone with a great amount of influence in your company, you won't be able to tell them to not use it. You can work on that over time. But these are some common business goals that your company might have, and so if you don't know the business goals, you can start by saying, hey, well, maybe we want to do this business goal. And the reason this is important is because this tells you what type of data you want to need. You want to collect and you want to be talking about. And so when you don't know, you can talk to your CTO, your VP of product, or your COO, anybody who's high enough in leadership that they might know. And if you're in a larger company, you might have to sort of go up the chain a couple steps to find those goals, or you might have to develop some goals that are specific to your team. But find a way to figure out what are some metrics that higher up people care about so that you can be tracking those as well. So today we're going to walk through an example of what all this looks like. I made up a wonderful company. It's called Chatterbox. It's basically fake Slack. Feel free to steal this if you really want to be fake Slack. But basically, you're working on this project. You're trying to redesign notification settings to make customization easier. So your boss's boss came down from on high and said, we need to fix notifications, they're broken. And that's all you've been told, go figure it out. And there's a lot of qualitative research that you want to do. But there's quantitative research that you want to do too. And the first thing is, what are Chatterbox's business goals? Well, Chatterbox this quarter is trying to reduce churn, increase mobile downloads, and increase referrals. And so of all those 3 business goals, if we come back to redesigning notification settings to make customization easier, which of these 3 goals are ones that we might be able to actually influence by doing this project? If you have a guess, you can throw it out. Otherwise, I'll just tell you what I think. I think any of these are correct. But for this today, we're going to talk about maybe we can reduce some churn if notifications don't suck so much, because who gets a lot of annoying notifications and they're like, delete the app, right? So then once you know what goal you're working towards for your project, you want to think, how do we overcome this obstacle with our project work? So our user experience goal here is notifications. Give the users the right information at the right time in the right format. So that's sort of how we take our business goal and turn it into a more helpful user goal. Now, of course, we have to talk about our audience, and you have to make sure you know who your audience is. No, this is apparently the only slide I have on audience. Not sure what I was going for there, but make sure you've defined your audience. And most of you know how to do that, so I'm not going to go into it here. So the next thing we need to do is start simple and obvious. So if our user experience goal is to give users the right information at the right time in the right format, what's the really obvious thing that we want to measure? How many people churn? Perfect. So the important thing to know is that this is the easiest way to get started in data, and it's the best way to get the most traction, because someone's already measuring it. There's someone in your company, if a business goal is churn, they're already measuring what churn is, so you don't have to go and figure out how to track churn. Someone's tracking it for you. You can get those numbers really easily, which is great because you can get a baseline right away. Once you know what's obvious, then you want to figure out, well, what questions do I have about that metric that relate to my goal? And the important thing when you're listing your questions is not to overcomplicate things. So if we're looking to give users the right information at the right time with notifications, we want to know how many people churn, but then we want to know how many people churn because of notifications, because that's more important. And I don't know if we can get this data right now, right, because we haven't gotten that far, but that's our next question, is how many people total are churning, so we know if that 15% is moving up or down, and then how many of them are actually because of notifications. Then we want to know, well, how many people are actually going to their notification settings anyway? We should probably find that out, and if we can, see how many of those people churn, but that's an unlikely correlation that we can find. That's harder. Then we want to figure out, once they've viewed their notification settings, does anybody actually customize it? How many people contact customer service about notifications? So these are just some basic questions. We can keep asking questions all day, right? We're researchers. We can just, that's our job. Question, question, question. And the great thing about all these questions is these are quantitative questions. I'm sure that you're all sitting there going, I have 100 qualitative questions as well. And that's perfect because you want to do these both. But this is the information that tells you more about the overarching story and patterns of what's happening. And it's important when you're looking at data. Too much data is not helpful. You don't want 30 numbers. You want a max of like 5 and really like 2 that you're talking about. And so when you have a question list, if you just want to list out all your questions, pare it back to 5 and under so that you're staying focused on the most important data points. Because if you come at somebody with 30 different numbers, they're going to get confused no matter how much they say they love data, I promise. So once you know what data you're trying to collect, you have to go out and get it. The best part of this was finding all these images. So now we're going to run through some tools that you can use to collect data. If you work at a company where you have system engineers and a whole IT department, you can actually ask them to do some complicated coding to track things for you, or they may already be tracking it. But if you are using an outside tool, we're going to walk through a couple of those right now, and I'm going to go pretty fast. So if you have questions, please hit me up afterward. So we're going to talk about heat maps, your customer service team, and a little bit about Google Analytics, only because it's free. So heat maps. I'm pretty sure everybody is familiar with heat maps. Anybody never seen a heat map before? Yes, brilliant. You all are amazing. So I'm not going to explain what's happening here. It's really easy to install heat maps. Heat maps tell you a couple of different things. They tell you where are people interacting with your page on this page, most often. They tell you dashboard usage. This is really helpful if you're focused on how does someone use our dashboard or our notifications. Scrolling behaviors. Do people go down the page? A lot of times you're red at the top and then it goes blue really quickly and you're like, oh, no one looks at this page. That's too bad. But then you can go and find out why. You can see important or confusing sections and where people think that there should be links that there aren't links, right? When people have clicked and nothing happens, and you can see that, and you're like, that's not a link, but I guess it should be. That's really interesting information. And so this is what heat maps tell you. The next thing is your customer service team. And now, I have yet to meet a company that is really making good use of the fact that customer service literally talks to users day in and day out. So please, if you take nothing else away from my talk, number 1, Star Trek, number 2, customer service team. This is important because they're literally getting qualitative data and quantitative data every day at scale. Like, you can't do as much research as the customer team has for you qualitatively, let alone quantitatively. And most customer service teams use something like Zendesk or Salesforce, and if they do that, great, just ask for access, and then it's on you to figure out how to get the data that you need. But if they don't use that, give them a spreadsheet and said, hey, can you just like put a 1 in here every time somebody calls about one of these topics so I can have a sense generally of how many different times these come up in a day? And that way, they can just populate it for you. Seriously, like bring them chocolates, whatever you have to do to make friends with your customer service team, get them involved in the conversation, in the research that you're doing, have them be a part of it all, because they have so much information for you. I really can't emphasize this enough. Customer service team tells us basically everything: immediate problems, stuff you didn't even know was a problem, detailed feedback, again, qualitative data at scale. You cannot do as much qualitative research as the customer service team has for you, I promise. Terminology changes, like when people call up and they say, oh, it's this thing up here, and they don't use the term that you've given it, that's really important information. Long-term pattern tracking. Customer service doesn't sleep, right? So people go on Twitter now, and if you don't respond in 10 minutes to my customer service Twitter problem, I think you are terrible. So day in and day out, people are asking for help with your tool. It doesn't stop on the weekend, it doesn't stop in the middle of the night. Always somebody is probably having a problem, and they're probably telling you about it. And so you can see this history over time. And the nice thing is if you're doing any sort of tracking, if they have Salesforce, you can get that history right away. And then again, things that you didn't even know were problems. So the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of how to collect data is Google Analytics. If you wanted to follow along, Google Analytics has a demo account, so you can check it out. The biggest problem with Google Analytics is it's a hot mess, right? They're like, well, just collect everything, figure it out, good luck. That's the hard part, because you can get data overwhelm in like 10 seconds or less. So I'm going to walk through a couple places where you can get useful information out of a Google Analytics. And the first is workflows. So if you go into the report here, all the way down to the bottom, user flows. And then the cool thing is that you've got country, and then you can see what page everybody starts on, where they go next, and how they drop off. And you can change the start page. You can organize it by devices and a bunch of other stuff in that country drop down. This is amazing, because this tells you how people walk through your product. And it's there, it's just hard to find and a little bit hard to slog through. But it's so valuable. So how do people move through your product? Common paths on mobile versus desktop, which is important if you're trying to decide what features you should and should not include on mobile. Drop-off points, abandonment points. Somebody got 3/4 of the way through taking an activity, and then they stopped, and that happens a lot. Something's wrong with that page. That's what Google Analytics Workflows tells you. Then we have time on page. Oh, my thing's in the wrong place, sorry. So if you go into the second one down, which is behavior, and you go here to all pages, the reason time on page is helpful is not because it always has to be higher. Again, context matters. I worked with a client, and we had this page, and people were coming there, and they were spending about 10 minutes on it. And then we made some updates based on some feedback that we got, and then people were spending less time. And he's like, oh no, is that bad? And I'm like, well, let's see what's actually happening. And what we found out was people were understanding information faster and moving on to the next step quicker, and he was actually getting more people to sign up. So time on page, more isn't always better. It may mean that your page is really confusing, or they were in the middle of doing something, couldn't figure it out, and then like wandered off to do something else and left the tab open. There's so many reasons time on page could be good or bad at any metric. But the important thing when you're doing time on page is, I like to sort it by, if you click on that advanced, you can set a minimum number of page views, so you're not getting that one person who stayed on that one random page for like 3 hours unhelpfully, because you don't care about that page if only one person's there, unless you have one customer. But you do care about sort of a low-level majority being on that page and having a problem, or potentially, if that's a really good page, how do we do more of that? So most important in confusing pages, mobile needs. Again, you can filter this by how to do things on mobile, and also starting points for different places to improve or to copy. And then the final thing is events. I love and hate events on Google because if you can pay for a software like Gainsight, they do this for you so you don't have to do this manually. But if you can't and you're stuck with free things, events allow you to track when people click or hover or navigate to different areas of your site. You can track specific flows of multiple pages to see how many people do that flow. But you have to do a bunch of coding to set it up. It's not a ton, and if you want to know how to do it, please talk to me after. I'm not going to run through it now. But events are helpful because once you've set them up, you can assign them categories, actions, and labels, and then you can see, okay, so for this category, I'm doing this thing. And events are in behavior again, events, and if you go to overview, this is on the overview page, but it's also in the top events page. And again, events are really helpful for tracking basically anything else that you want to track that isn't natively tracked by Google Analytics, so specific patterns, specific clicks, anything like that. And you can also assign it a monetary value, which is really helpful for people on your sales and marketing team. The other thing I will say is also make friends with your sales and marketing team, because user research and marketing research are two sides of the same thing, and you should be collaborating. So when you're collecting data, remember to not go too in-depth too fast. Remember, we only had like 5 things we were looking for, so we're not going to go too deep on our data. You can in the future, and if you want to pursue data scientist, go for it. But you really just want to get some good information to help you start to make decisions. Prioritize what matters now, and then focus on 1 to 3 things to start. That way you're not overwhelming yourself. As you get better, you'll find you can do more complicated things. I encourage that, but don't start there. So now you need to analyze your data, right? We have all this data. What do we do? Well, the first thing to remember, and I know I've said this a lot, data is just numbers until we ascribe meaning to it. So now that we have some numbers, let's assign some meaning. So review your results and look for patterns. So we had these 5 questions when we started talking about Chatterbox. How do people churn? How many because of notifications? And then what are they doing in the notifications section? And when are they calling customer service? So here's the data that we were given. 26% of people churn each month. Of those 26%, 12% who churned mentioned notifications. So we don't know about the people who didn't mention anything, but we know at least 12% of the 26% churned because of notifications. 46% of users visit their notification section, but only 29% actually make changes. Wonder if our save button's in a bad spot. 22% of users contact customer service about their notifications. So there's a bunch of data here. We're not going to use all of it right away. The 2 things that we're going to focus on to start making decisions are 12% of the 26 mention notification when they're churning, because that's the thing that we want to change to show to our business, hey, we're thinking about your goals, and this work has relevance to where you're taking the company. And then 22% of users contact customer service about notifications, because that's going to actually tell us more from the start, because we can go talk to customer service. And that's probably going to be related to those other 2 metrics that we're going to ignore. So again, quantitative data never tells us why something happened. It just tells us where to look, right? So once you've figured out what patterns you're looking for, what data you're going to focus on, let's go make decisions. No, we're actually going to ask more questions and do more research. So where should we look? 3% of the people churned and mentioned notifications, so that's 12% of 26%. So our questions are, well, why? What did they say about notifications? And the good thing is we might have some info on this already and we might not. Was that the only factor about why they left? And where did they struggle? So those are some questions that we have, some of which we might know the answers to, but some of which we might not. And then when we think about 22% of users contacted customer service, I know that's not, we don't abbreviate customer service that way, it's okay, about notifications. What did they ask about? Is there a pattern in what they're calling about? And can we follow up with any of those people for more details? The important thing to remember here is that correlation does not equal causation. And so we cannot assume that just because 46% of people went to notifications and only 29% actually did anything about it, that was because it was confusing or because it wasn't. We just don't know yet. Because here's the thing. User experience as a term has gotten more and more popular, but the book Tuesdays with Morrie has gotten less and less popular. Coincidence? I don't think so, guys. We Ruined Tuesdays with Morrie. I've actually never read that book. It's just a good downward trend. So when you have data, do not draw conclusions. I know it's tempting to draw conclusions from looking at data, but you literally can't. Data is just numbers. It's just telling you literally what happened. It does never tells you why. Probably another never in there. But you can use it as a starting point for what to do next. And to just sort of drive the point home, if you go to Amazon and you say, oh, 4.5 stars, 24 customer reviews. Great, let me see what those reviews say, because who knows? And then you see this. And you're like, well, none of that is helpful. A year ago, a week ago, you didn't give me anything. What does 5 stars mean? Did they pay you? Are you best friends with the owner? Like, you need more context. And the same goes for any data that you get. You always will need more context. And I know that CEOs and bosses love to talk a big game about, I just like the hard numbers. Nobody likes the hard numbers. We all like stories, and we're all emotional decision makers. I don't care who you are, nobody's objective. So when you're doing this and you have data, get qualitative data that tells you why, and then draw your final conclusions. And then go back and probably do more research. So the last question that you want to ask yourself is, what things should we make sure not to change that are working? And so we have this tendency when we're looking for research and to uncover problems. But let's also make sure we're uncovering good things, because if we mess up something that's going well, customers are going to be mad about it. And customers are always going to be mad, no matter what you change, no matter how much better it is, because people don't like change. But make sure you're not changing something that actually was a good thing. So once you've done more research and you've gotten more information, you need to hypothesize and test some solutions. So a hypothesis. It's an educated theory about how to solve the problem that you've identified. And educated in that we have knowledge and research that supports our theory and potential, and now we need to test and see if it's true, right? And the problem you identified, well, that's your project. So I have a basic hypothesis framework. Feel free to use it whenever you want. So we believe that if we take a specific action, then a desired result will follow. Cool, that sounds fun. So we believe that if we train customer service reps in successful conversion and anti-cancellation methods, we can reduce customer cancellations. So what do you notice about this solution? Does it have anything to do with changing the product? No, it's not even a design solution. But that's a cool thing, is that when you do research and you're not set on a specific solution and you're just uncovering information, you find other potential solutions. So that's cool. But what if we wanted a design solution? So we believe that if we make default notifications better, we can decrease the churn for our target audience. That sounds like a good hypothesis to test. We also believe that if we add clarity to the notification settings, we can reduce confusion for our target audience. So those are 2 hypotheses that you might want to take to your design team and say, hey, let's test this out and see if this is true based on all the research that I did. And then you can measure it because you had a baseline. So all that data collection you did, that's where you were. When you go and you do this and you implement it and you measure it over the same time frame, now you know if it went up or down. If you only measure afterwards, you don't know if it's better or worse because you don't know what the before was. Is 6 better? Better than what? You need that baseline. So when you're testing your changes, these are some things you can do to measure if it's successful or not. Most of these you probably are familiar with. But above all, make sure you're using the same method of tracking and over the same time frame. If you have data from a 3-month period and you compare that to data from a 1-month period, that's not great. If you have data from Christmas time and you're an e-commerce store and you compare that to data from February, also not great. So make sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you're looking at new information. So, sorry I broke the Star Trek trend. Let me sum up. Define the intended impact of your work using your business and project goals with numbers as much as possible. And here's the thing about goals. They're all made up. I don't care what method you use, they're made up. Goals are made up because they're things we want to achieve in the future. They're just a target. So if you don't have numbers, make them up and see where you land. You may totally miss them, but then you know more about how to set goals the next time. Identify and prioritize your audience. List your questions to determine the basic metrics that you need to understand the project and track the goal. And then use quantitative and qualitative data together to ensure that you really understand the problem and that you're not just drawing conclusions that aren't really there. Hypothesize a solution and then test it and measure against the same data, apples to apples. So that's everything I've covered today. I'm going to take questions now, and Roy's going to tell me which one's the best and who gets my book. Thank you very much.